There we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to I Truly. I'm at it. So I am going to be Tarzan of the. Pretty excited about it. Post finished with me soon. So let me do a quick read in the last couple of order. Side of Tarzan's family home with her maid, and the two of them are locked inside while prowling around trying to get in Sora. So she had locked herself inside. Lioness tried to get in the lock mechanism, prowling her way in, and at the end of last chapter had carefully wedged, pry open one of the windows, and Jane fainted. Merelda had fainted. And the last thing that Jane saw was that the lioness had moved half of her body. A moment more, and both shoulders, the long, sick body, would glide. So at this point, we know that cutting out a lot. We'll turn off the noise gate for right now. I don't know. I'm trying to eliminate the clicks from when I'm typing or when I'm using my mouse. So there we go. So I went ahead and turned off the gate, but the suppression is still on. Thank you, Fallen, for pointing that out for me. So, as I said before, we were in the last chapter. Jane had passed out, and the lioness had managed to wedge herself through the window, and Jane woke up. She had fired the gun once. I don't know what type of weapon it is, whether she can. It's a repeater, and she can actually fire it more than once. But things are very scary for the two women that are passed out on the floor inside. And Jane just woke up to see the lioness forcing her way through the window. We are on to chapter 15, The Forest God. And let me grab that. I've got my water, I've got my coffee. I'm good to go. All right, thank you, Fallen. I appreciate that. The new gate may be too strong. Yeah. Yeah. The noise gate, I'm gonna have to fiddle with it. YouTube tutorial. Doing my best. All right. I think the noise suppression is still working though, and that might be all that I need. Yeah, I I mean, I don't typically have too much like active background noise, but it's still useful to have because sometimes the dogs are barking. My dogs are barking. Sometimes the mailman or the garbage man is fiddling around outside. So, just trying to be cogent and aware. Yeah, I agree, Fallen. They're typically more work. Also, welcome in, Jules. All right, everybody, let's get started on this next chapter and see how far we get today. Chapter 15: The Forest God. When Clayton heard the report of the firearm, he fell into an agony of fear and apprehension. He knew that one of the sailors might be the author of it, but the fact that he had left the revolver with Jane Porter, together with the overwrought condition of his nerves, made him morbidly positive that she was threatened with some great danger, perhaps even now attempting to defend herself against some savage man or beast. I pressed something. There we go. What were the thoughts of his strange captor or guide? Clayton could only vaguely conjecture, but that he had heard the shot and was in some manner affected by it was quite evident, for he quickened his pace so appreciably that Clayton, stumbling blindly in his wake, was down a dozen times.
Edgar 13 gifted 2 subscriptions to the community.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Higara. 2 gifted subs, electifying, and the Golden Magpie. That's a great name. I hope you enjoy your emotes. There we go. Huh. It is not picking up the changes. Up, down, side to side. It is not. Well. Well, that's a question for another day, I guess. Thank you, Hikara. And yes, lots of dabs. Let's see, why are you like this? Okay. Second state. Down. Okay. Up, down, up. Okay. And Hidara, thank you, Higara, for the head pats. What were the thoughts of his strange captor or guide? Clayton could only vaguely conjecture, but that he had heard the shot and was in some manner affected by it was quite evident, for he quickened his pace so appreciably that Clayton, stumbling blindly in his wake, was down a dozen times in as many minutes in a vain effort to keep pace with him, and soon was left hopelessly behind. Oh, thank you, Tiger Faye. Fearing that he would again be irretrievably lost, he called aloud to the wild man ahead of him, and in a moment had the satisfaction of seeing him drop lightly to his side from the branches above. For a moment, Tarzan looked at the young man closely, as though undecided as to just what was best to do. Then, stooping down before Clayton, he motioned him to grasp him about the neck, and with the white man upon his... gross. He motioned him to grasp him about the neck, and with the man upon his back, Tarzan took to the trees. The next few minutes were such as the young Englishman never forgot. High into bending and swaying branches he was borne with what seemed to him incredible swiftness, while Tarzan chafed at the slowness of his progress. From one lofty branch the agile creature swung with Clayton through a dizzy arc to a neighboring tree. Then, for 100 yards, maybe, the sure feet threaded a maze of interwoven limbs, balancing like a tightrope walker high above the black depths of the verdure beneath. From the first sensation of chilling fear, Clayton passed to one of keen admiration and envy of those giant muscles and that wondrous instinct or knowledge which guided this forest god through the inky blackness of the night as easily and safely as Clayton could have strolled a London street at high noon. Occasionally they would enter a spot where the foliage above was less dense, and the bright rays of the moon lit up before Clayton's wondering eyes the strange path they were traversing. At such times the man fairly caught his breath at sight of the horrid depths below them, for Tarzan took the easiest way, which often led over 100 feet above the earth. And yet, with all his seeming speed, Tarzan was in reality feeling his way with comparative slowness, searching constantly for limbs or adequate strength for the maintenance of this double weight. Presently, they came to the clearing before the beach. Tarzan's quick ears had heard the strange sounds of Sabor's efforts to force her way through the lattice, and it seemed to Clayton that they dropped a straight 100 feet to earth. So quickly did Tarzan descend. Yet, when they struck the ground, it was with scarce a jar, and as Clayton released his hold on the ape man, he saw him dart like a squirrel for the opposite side of the cabin. The Englishman sprang quickly after him just in time to see the hind quarters of some huge animal about to disappear through the window of the cabin. As Jane Porter opened her eyes to a realization of the again imminent peril which threatened her, her brave young heart gave up at last its final vestige of hope, and she turned to grope for the fallen weapon that she might meet to herself a merciful death ere the cruel fangs tore into her fair flesh. Scary. The lioness was almost through the opening before Jane found the weapon, and she raised it quickly to her temple to shut out forever the hideous jaws gaping for their prey. An instant she hesitated, to breathe a short and silent prayer to her Maker, and as she did so, her eyes fell upon her poor Esmeralda lying inert, but alive, beside the cupboard. How could she leave the poor, faithful thing to those merciless yellow fangs? No, she must use one cartridge on the senseless woman ere she turned the cold muzzle toward herself again. How she shrank from the ordeal! But it had been cruelty 1,000 times less justifiable to have left the loving woman who had reared her from infancy with all a mother's care and solicitude to regain consciousness beneath the rending claws of the great cat. Quickly, Jane Porter sprang to her feet and ran to the side of the woman. She pressed the muzzle of the revolver tight against that devoted heart, closed her eyes, and Sabor emitted a frightful shriek. The girl, startled, pulled the trigger and turned to face the beast, and with the same movement raised the weapon against her own temple. She did not fire a second time, for to her surprise she saw the huge animal being slowly drawn back through the window, and in the moonlight beyond she saw the heads and shoulders of two men. As Clayton rounded the corner of the cabin to behold the animal disappearing within, it was also to see the ape man seize the long tail in both hands and, bracing himself with his feet against the side of the cabin, throw all his mighty strength into the effort to draw the beast out of the interior. Clayton was quick to lend a hand, but the ape man jabbered to him in a commanding and peremptory tone something which Clayton knew to be orders, though he could not understand them. At last, under their combined efforts, the great body commenced to appear farther and farther without the window, and then there came to Clayton's mind a dawning conception of the rash bravery of his companion's act. For a naked man to drag a shrieking, clawing man-eater forth from a window by the tail to save a strange girl was indeed the last word in heroism. In so far as Clayton was concerned, it was a very different matter, since the girl was not only of his own kind but was the one woman in all the world whom he loved. Though he knew that the lioness would make short work of both of them, he pulled with a will to keep it from Jane Porter, and then he recalled the battle between this man and the great black-maned lion, which he had witnessed a short time before, and he commenced to feel more assurance. Tarzan was still issuing orders which Clayton could not understand. He was trying to tell the stupid man to plunge his poisoned arrows into Sabor's back and sides, and to reach the savage heart with the long, thin hunting knife that hung at Tarzan's hip. But the man would not understand, and Tarzan did not dare release his hold to do the things himself, for he knew that the puny man never could hold mighty Sabor alone for an instant. Slowly the lioness was emerging from the window. At last her shoulders were out. And then Clayton saw a thing done which not even the eternal heavens had ever seen before. Tarzan, racking his brains for some means to cope single-handed with the infuriated beast, had suddenly recalled his battle with Turcos. And as the great shoulders came clear of the window, so that the lioness hung upon the sill only by her forepaws, Tarzan suddenly released his hold upon the brute. With the quickness of a striking rattler, he launched himself full upon Sabor's back, his strong young arm seeking and gaining a full Nelson upon the beast, as he had learned it that other day during his bloody wrestling victory over Turcos. With a shriek, the lioness turned completely over upon her back, falling full upon her enemy, but the black-haired giant only closed tighter his hold. Pawing and tearing at earth and air, Sabor rolled and threw herself this way and that in an effort to dislodge this strange antagonist, but ever tighter and tighter drew the iron bands that were forcing her head lower and lower upon her tawny breast. Higher crept the steel forearms of the ape-man about the back of Sabor's neck. Weaker and weaker became the lioness's efforts. At last Clayton saw the immense muscles of Tarzan's shoulders and biceps leap into corded knots beneath the silver moonlight. There was a long, sustained, and supreme effort on the ape-man's part, and the vertebrae of Sabor's neck parted with a sharp snap. Oof. In an instant, Tarzan was upon his feet, and for the second time that day, Clayton heard the bull ape's savage roar of victory. Then he heard Jane Porter's agonized cry. "Cecil? Mr. Clayton? Oh, what is it? What is it?" Running quickly to the cabin door, Clayton called out that all was right and bade her open. As quickly as she could, she raised the great bar and fairly dragged Clayton within. "What was that awful noise?" she whispered, shrinking close to him. "It was the cry of the kill from the throat of the man who has just saved your life, Miss Porter. Wait, I will fetch him that you may thank him." The frightened girl would not be left alone, so she accompanied Clayton to the side of the cabin where lay the dead body of the lioness. Tarzan of the Apes was gone. Clayton called several times, but there was no reply, and so the two returned to the greater safety of the interior. "What a frightful sound!" cried Jane Porter. "I shudder at the mere thought of it. Do not tell me that human throat voiced that hideous and fearsome shriek." "But it did, Miss Porter," replied Clayton, "or at least, if not a human throat, that of a forest god." Hey, yo! And then he told her of his experiences with this strange creature, of how twice the wild man had saved his life, of the wondrous strength and agility and bravery of the brown skin and the handsome face. "I cannot make it out at all," he concluded. "At first I thought he might be Tarzan of the Apes, but he neither speaks nor understands English, so that theory is untenable." "Well, whatever he may be," cried the girl, "we owe him our lives, and may God bless him and keep him in safety in his wild and savage jungle." "Amen," said Clayton fervently. For the good Lord's sake, ain't I dead? Ain't I dead?" Oh, okay, I see. For the good Lord's sake, ain't I dead?" The two turned to see Esmeralda sitting upright upon the floor, her great eyes rolling from side to side as though she could not believe their testimony as to her whereabouts. The lioness's shriek, as Jane Porter had been about to put a bullet into poor Esmeralda, had saved the woman's life. For the little start the girl gave had turned the muzzle of the revolver to one side, and the bullet had passed harmlessly into the floor. And now, for Jane Porter, the reaction came, and she threw herself upon the bench, screaming with hysterical laughter. That poor woman. Very brutal. I can't believe he used his like a full Nelson and broke the neck of the lioness. That's wild. That is definitely ape man level strength for sure. All right, where are we at here? So that was the first chapter from today. We're gonna probably read about 5, possibly 6 chapters all told, depending on how long it takes. Oh wow, thank you for the donation. Um, I really appreciate that. I'm moving towards moving away from subscription or like subs on Twitch because I honestly had enough. Well, you weren't that sneaky, so darn. Thank you, Fallen. Thank you for the donation. Um, we we as Twitch creators do a lot of content, and on the browser they raised the prices once on subs from $4.99 to I think it was $5.99, and then they raised the browser or on the mobile from $5.99 to $6.99, and they just announced another increase, and I would rather give my money directly to creators. So if anybody has a coffee link or a throne link or some other way to give them my $5, I would rather do that because it touches on getting the money directly to the creator a little bit faster, directly, in fact, in some cases. But that's my own personal ethos. I digress. We are on to chapter 16, and I will, like I said, read about 5 or 6 chapters. Thank you so much, Fallen, for the donation. Um, that is working towards the rigging, I believe, I'm going to have done, which I finally did get a video from my rigger yesterday. I'm really excited to see how much progress that they're making, and I should have a better idea of when to plan for a debut. And maybe it'll be my affiliate anniversary here at the end of October, beginning November. I don't know. I'm not sure how long it'll take them to do everything that they need to do. But either way, I'm looking forward to it and being able to be a little bit more mobile than just up, down, or my PNGs for gaming or for art streams, which I still haven't done yet, but I will eventually. Oh, while it's fresh in my mind, I wanted to do a shout out for I believe it was Goblin Corn. They were super kind. They were an up and coming streamer as well. If I can find them. Bear with me a second. User error. They were streaming earlier today. Yeah. I can't find it. I'll probably have to go to their actual server to grab it. Oh, it's because it's alright, that makes sense. There we go. So I found this other streamer. They're part of the same community as Mao and Nicto, who's an amazing creator who does like music and audio work for other streamers. Let me grab, so there we go. That should post. So this is another VTuber, if it'll play. Maybe I need to do the @ symbol.
Oh, I am thoroughly impressed. That sheep. I think that sheep made this run. I wouldn't mind if someone clipped that. The fucking sheep comes out of nowhere. I'm the type of that has the mindset of game mechanic, I'm gonna use it. I'm using the Dung Eater Summoners in my playthrough. Oh really? That's kind of thematic. That's true. Normally I agree with that. I just want to try it. Like if I get frustrated, like I almost.
Yes. So they're another streamer that I just recently found. That is their old PNG. They have a live 2D model now as well. And since I have a couple of other people in here whom I love, so most recently, so Fallen, you just typed, so I'll give you a ha ha ha. Get loved on, nerd. There we go. I don't know how many shouts I can do, but I will do a few. So Fallen Thespian is another amazing content creator, variety streamer, game streams. Oh, speaking of,
this is Edinburgh Castle. It doesn't look anything like this in real life. Oh, really weirdly zoomed in. Where are the enemy coming?
Victory! These ancient stones still stand, sire. All thanks to your simply superior strategizing.
What? That's...
Interesting. Yes, so I think I might be at my limit for right now, but probably in a few minutes. So I'm very fortunate in the friends and people that I get to support, and I'm really excited to continue to do so through other means besides the Twitch subsystem. So everybody, thank you for listening to me ramble, and check out Fallen, and check out they go by the Goblicorn on Twitch, but they go by Nex in their About Me section. Stronghold, yes. The stronghold where they forgot to send any enemies. Oh, that's funny. Okay. We are on to chapter 16. Most remarkable. Several miles south of the cabin, upon a strip of sandy beach, stood two old men arguing. Before them stretched the broad Atlantic, at their backs the dark continent. Close around them loomed the impenetrable blackness of the jungle.
Little Trike who just followed.
Welcome in, and thanks for the follow. Savage beasts roared and growled. Noises hideous and weird assailed their ears. They had wandered for miles in search of their camp, but always in the wrong direction. They were as hopelessly lost as though they suddenly had been transported to another world. At such a time, indeed, must every fiber of their combined intellects have been concentrated upon the vital question of the minute. The minute, perhaps? Concentrated upon the vital question of the minute. The life and death question to them of retracing their steps to camp. Samuel T. Philanderer, my goodness. Samuel T. Philander was speaking. But, my dear professor, he was saying, I still maintain that but for the victories of Ferdinand and Isabella over the 15th century Moors in Spain, the world would be today 1,000 years in advance of where we now find ourselves. Hot take. The Moors were essentially a tolerant, broad-minded, liberal race of agriculturists, artisans, and merchants, the very type of people that has made possible such civilization as we find today in America and Europe, while the Spaniards... Oh my. Tut-tut, dear Mr. Philander, interrupted Professor Porter. For those not in the know, that is, her father. Their religion positively precluded the possibilities you suggest. Muslimism? I've never seen it spelled like that. Muslimism. Wow, that's a struggle. Muslimism was, is, and always will be a blight on the scientific progress which has marked... My goodness. Bless me, Professor.
Sir Knight Natsu just followed.
Welcome in, Sir Knight Natsu. And Little Triku. Thank you for the follow, both of you. Bless me, Professor, interjected Mr. Philander, who had turned his gaze toward the jungle. There seems to be someone approaching. Professor Archimedes Q. Porter turned in the direction indicated by the nearsighted Mr. Philander. Tut-tut, Mr. Philander, he chided. How often must I urge you to seek that absolute concentration of your mental facilities, which alone may permit you to bring to bear the highest powers of intellectuality upon the momentous problems which naturally fall to the lot of great minds. That was a mouthful. And now, I find you guilty of a most flagrant breach of courtesy in interrupting my learned discourse to call attention to a mere quadruped of the genus Felis. As I was saying, Mr. Heavens, Professor, a lion? Cried Mr. Philander, straining his weak eyes toward the dim figure outlined against the dark tropical underbrush. Yes, Mr. Philander, if you insist upon employing slang in your discourse, a lion. But as I was saying— Bless me, Professor, again interrupted Mr. Philander. Permit me to suggest that doubtless the Moors who were conquered in the 15th century will continue in that most regrettable condition, for the time being at least, even though we postpone discussion of that world calamity until we may attain the enchanting view of yon Felis carnivora, which distance proverbially is credited with lending. In the meantime, the lion had approached with quiet dignity to within 10 paces of the two men, where he stood curiously watching them. The moonlight flooded the beach, and the strange group stood out in bold relief against the yellow sand. Most reprehensible, exclaimed Professor Porter, with a faint trace of irritation in his voice. Never, Mr. Philander, never before in my life have I known one of these animals to be permitted to roam at large from its cage. I shall most certainly report this outrageous breach of ethics to the directors of the adjacent zoological garden. They're in Africa? Okay. Quite right, Professor, agreed Mr. Philander, and the sooner it is done, the better. Let us start now. Seizing the professor by the arm, Mr. Philander set off in the direction that would put the greatest distance between themselves and the lion. They had proceeded but a short distance when a backward glance revealed to the horrified gaze of Mr. Philander that the lion was following them. He tightened his grip upon the protesting professor and increased his speed. As I was saying, Mr. Philander, repeated Professor Porter. Mr. Philander took another hasty glance rearward. The lion also had quickened his gait and was doggedly maintaining an unvarying distance behind them. He is following us, gasped Mr. Philander, breaking into a run. Tut, Mr. Philander, remonstrated the professor. This unseemly haste is most unbecoming men of letters. I do not believe that Professor Porter has quite grasped the nature of the situation he finds himself in. And I don't know that Mr. Philander can properly explain it to him in due course. My goodness. What will our friends think of us, who may chance to be upon the street and witness our frivolous antics? Pray let us proceed with more decorum. Mr. Philander stole another observation astern. Horrors! The lion was bounding along in easy leaps, scarce 5 paces behind. Mr. Philander dropped the professor's arm and broke into a mad orgy of speed that would have done credit to any varsity track team. As I was saying, Mr. Philander, screamed Professor Porter, as, metaphorically speaking, he himself threw her into high. He, too, had caught a fleeting backward glimpse of cruel, yellow eyes and half-open mouth within startling proximity of his person. With streaming coattails and shiny silk hat, Professor Archimedes Q. Porter fled through the moonlight close upon the heels of Mr. Samuel T. Philander. Before them, a point of the jungle ran out toward a narrow promontory, and it was for the haven of the trees he saw there that Mr. Samuel T. Philander directed his prodigious leaps and bounds, while from the shadows of this same spot peered 2 keen eyes in interested appreciation of the race. It was Tarzan of the Apes who watched, with face a grin, this odd game of follow the leader. He knew the two men were safe enough from attack insofar as the lion was concerned. The very fact that Numa had forgone such easy prey at all convinced the wise forest craft of Tarzan that Numa's belly already was full. The lion might stalk them until hungry again, but the chances were that if not angered, he would soon tire of the sport and slink away to his jungle lair. Really, the one great danger was that one of the men might stumble and fall, and then the yellow devil would be upon him in a moment, and the joy of the kill would be too great a temptation to withstand. Whew. So Tarzan swung quickly to a lower limb, in line with the approaching fugitives, and as Mr. Samuel T. Philander came panting and blowing beneath him, already too spent to struggle up to the safety of the limb, Tarzan reached down and grasped him by the collar of his coat, yanked him to the limb by his side. Another moment brought the professor within the sphere of the friendly grip, and he, too, was drawn upward to safety just as the baffled Numa was, with a roar, leaped to recover his vanishing quarry. Can you imagine? For a moment the two men clung, panting to the great branch, while Tarzan squatted with his back to the stem of the tree, watching them with mingled curiosity and amusement. It was the professor who first broke the silence. "I am deeply pained, Mr. Philander, that you should have evinced such a paucity of manly courage in the presence of one of the lower orders, and by your crass timidity have caused me to exert myself to such an unaccustomed degree in order that I might resume my discourse." Oh, Archimedes. As I was saying, Mr. Philander, when you interrupted me, the Moors... Professor Archimedes Q. Porter broke in, Mr. Philander, in icy tones. "The time has arrived when patience becomes a crime and mayhem appears garbed in the mantle of virtue. You have accused me of cowardice. You have insinuated that you ran only to overtake me, not to escape the clutches of the lion. Have a care, Professor Archimedes Q. Porter. I am a desperate man. Goaded by long-suffering patience, the worm will turn." "Tut-tut, Mr. Philander, tut-tut," cautioned Professor Porter. "You forget yourself." "I forget nothing as yet, Professor Archimedes Q. Porter, but believe me, sir, I am tottering on the verge of forgetfulness as to your exalted position in the world of science and your gray hairs." The professor sat in silence for a few minutes, and the darkness hid the grim smile that wreathed his wrinkled countenance. Presently he spoke. "Look here, Skinny Philander," he said, in belligerent tones, "if you're looking for a scrap, peel off your coat and come on down on the ground, and I'll punch your head just as I did 60 years ago in the alley back of Porky Evans' barn." "Ark!" gasped the astonished Mr. Philander. "Lordy, how good that sounds! When you're human, Ark, I love you, but somehow it seems as though you had forgotten how to be human for the last 20 years. The professor reached out a thin, trembling old hand through the darkness until it found his old friend's shoulder. "Forgive me, Skinny," he said softly. "It hasn't been quite 20 years, and God alone knows how hard I have tried to be human for Jane's sake, and yours too, since he took my other Jane away. Since he took my other Jane away." Another old hand stole up from Mr. Philander's side to clasp the one that lay upon his shoulder, and no other message could better have translated the one heart to the other. A little romance, perhaps? They did not speak for some minutes. The lion below them paced nervously back and forth. The third figure in the tree was hidden by the dense shadows near the stem. He too was silent, motionless as a graven image. You certainly pulled me up into this tree just in time, said the professor at last. I want to thank you, for you saved my life. But I didn't pull you up here, Professor, said Mr. Philander. Bless me, the excitement of the moment quite caused me to forget that I myself was drawn up here by some outside agency. There must be someone or something in this tree with us. Eh? Ejaculated Professor Porter. Are you quite positive, Mr. Philander? Most positive, Professor, replied Mr. Philander, and, he added, I think we should thank the party. He may be sitting right next to you now, Professor. Eh? What's that? Tut-tut, Mr. Philander, tut-tut. And Professor Porter, edging cautiously nearer to Mr. Philander. My goodness. Welcome in, Lasada. Just then it occurred to Tarzan of the Apes that Numa had loitered beneath the tree for a sufficient length of time. So he raised his young head toward the heavens, and there rang out upon the terrified ears of the two old men the awful warning challenge of the anthropoid. The two friends, huddled, trembling in their precarious position on the limb, saw the great lion halt in his restless pacing as the blood-curdling cry smote his ears, and then slink quickly into the jungle so to be instantly lost to view. Even the lion trembles in fear, whispered Mr. Philander. Most remarkable, murmured Professor Porter, clutching frantically at Mr. Philander to regain the balance which the sudden fright had so perilously endangered. Unfortunately for them both, Mr. Philander's center of equilibrium was at that very moment hanging upon the ragged edge of nothing, so that it needed but the gentle impetus supplied by the additional weight of Professor Porter's body to topple the devoted secretary from the limb. Oh no. So there he is, like, he's not thinking about it. His balance is so precarious, and then the professor just leans into him because he's scared. And oh dear. For a moment they swayed uncertainly, and then, with mingled and most unscholarly shrieks, they pitched headlong from the tree, locked in frenzied embrace. Wow. Just wow. It was quite some it's just, I need a second. Gotta rein it in. It was quite some moments ere either moved, for both were positive that any such attempt would reveal so many breaks and fractures as to make further progress impossible. At length, Professor Porter essayed an attempt to move one leg. To his surprise, it responded to his will as in days gone by. He now drew up its mate and stretched forth again. Most remarkable, he murmured. Thank God, Professor, whispered Mr. Philander fervently. You are not dead, then? Tut-tut, Mr. Philander, tut-tut, cautioned Professor Porter. I do not know with accuracy as yet. With infinite solicitude, Professor Porter wiggled his right arm. Joy! It was intact. Breathlessly, he waved his left arm above his prostrate body. It waved. Most remarkable, he said. To whom are you signaling, Professor? Asked Mr. Philander in an excited tone. Professor Porter deigned to make no response to this puerile inquiry. Instead, he raised his head gently from the ground, nodding it back and forth a half-dozen times. Most remarkable, he breathed. It remains intact. Mr. Philander had not moved from where he had fallen. He had not dared the attempt. How indeed could one move when one's arms and legs and back were broken? One eye was buried in the soft loam, the other, rolling sidewise, was fixed in awe upon the strange gyrations of Professor Porter. Ah, the absurdity. How sad, exclaimed Mr. Philander, half aloud. Concussion of the brain, superinducing total mental aberration. How very sad indeed, and for one still so young. Professor Porter rolled over upon his stomach. Gingerly he bowed his back until he resembled a huge tomcat in proximity to a yelping dog. Then he sat up and felt of various portions of his anatomy. They are all here, he ejaculated. Most remarkable. Phrasing. Whereupon he arose, and bending a scathing glance upon the still prostrate form of Mr. Samuel T. Philander, he said, Tut, tut, Mr. Philander, this is no time to indulge in slothful ease. We must be up and doing. Thank you for the giant emote, Fallen. Mr. Philander lifted his other eye out of the mud and gazed in speechless rage at Professor Porter. Then he attempted to rise, nor could there have been any more surprise than he when his efforts were immediately crowned with marked success. This is the most British thing I have ever read, and I read The Jungle Book. He used the word puerile. Just, this is incredible. Oh my goodness. He was still bursting with rage, however, at the cruel injustice of Professor Porter's insinuation, and was on the point of rendering a tart rejoinder when his eyes fell upon a strange figure standing a few paces away, scrutinizing them intently. Professor Porter had recovered his shiny silk hat, which he had brushed carefully upon the sleeve of his coat and replaced upon his head. When he saw Mr. Philander pointing to something behind him, he turned to behold a giant, naked, but for a loincloth and a few metal ornaments standing motionless before him. Good evening, sir, said the professor, lifting his hat. For reply, the giant motioned them to follow him and set off up the beach in the direction from which they had recently come. I think it the part of discretion to follow him, said Mr. Philander. Tut, tut, Mr. Philander, returned the professor. A short time since you were advancing most logical argument in substantiation of your theory that camp lay directly south of us. I was skeptical, but you finally convinced me, so now I am positive that toward the south we must travel to reach our friends. Therefore, I shall continue south. I hope he just picks him up and just tucks him under his arm and carries him the rest of the way. That's how I imagine Tarzan's going to do it. But Professor Porter, this man may know better than either of us. He seems to be indigenous to this part of the world. Let us at least follow him for a short distance. Tut, tut, Mr. Philander, repeated the professor. I am a difficult man to convince, but when once convinced my decision is unalterable, I shall continue in the proper direction. If I have to circumambulate the continent of Africa to reach my destination, Wow. Further argument was interrupted by Tarzan, who, seeing that these strange men were not following him, had returned to their side. Again he beckoned to them, but still they stood in argument. Presently the ape-man lost patience with their stupid ignorance. He grasped the frightened Mr. Philander by the shoulder, and before that worthy gentleman knew whether he was being killed or merely maimed for life, Tarzan had tied one end of his rope securely around Mr. Philander's neck. Oh no! Had tied one end of his rope securely about Mr. Philander's neck. "Tut, tut, Mr. Philander," remonstrated Professor Porter. "It is most unbeseeming in you to submit to such indignities." But scarcely were the words out of his mouth, ere he too had been seized and securely bound by the neck with the same rope. Then Tarzan set off toward the north, leading the now thoroughly frightened professor and his secretary. In deathly silence, they proceeded for what seemed hours to the two tired and hopeless old men. But presently, as they topped a little rise of ground, they were overjoyed to see the cabin lying before them, not 100 yards distant. Here Tarzan released them, and, pointing toward the little building, vanished into the jungle beside them. "Most remarkable, most remarkable," gasped the professor. "But you see, Mr. Philander, that I was quite right, as usual, and but for your stubborn wilfulness, we should have escaped a series of most humiliating, not to say dangerous, accidents. Pray allow yourself to be guided by a more mature and practical mind hereafter, when in need of wise counsel. How delusional is Professor Porter? Wow. Suddenly, the way his character acted in the Disney Tarzan movie makes so much more sense. A little hydration. There we go. Mr. Samuel T. Philander was too much relieved at the happy outcome of their adventure to take umbrage at the professor's cruel fling. Instead, he grasped his friend's arm and hastened him forward in the direction of the cabin. It was a much relieved party of castaways that found itself once more united. Dawn discovered them still recounting their various adventures and speculating upon the identity of the strange guardian and protector they had found on this savage shore. Esmeralda was positive that it was none other than an angel of the Lord, sent down specially to watch over them. Had you seen him devour the raw meat of the lion, Esmeralda, laughed Clayton, you would have thought him a very material angel. I don't know nothing about that, Massa Clay, rejoined Esmeralda, but I specs he de Lord clean forgot to give him any matches. He sent him down in such a hurry to look after we all, and he certainly can't cook nothing 'thout matches. No, sir. My goodness. There was nothing heavenly about his voice. There was nothing heavenly about his voice, said Jane Porter, with a little shudder at recollection of the awful roar which had followed the killing of the lioness. Nor did it precisely comport with my preconceived ideas of the dignity of divine messengers, remarked Professor Porter, when the gentlemen tied two highly respectable and erudite scholars neck to neck and dragged them through the jungle as though they had been cows. This story was a wild ride. That one chapter was all over the place. I think we have time for probably one more chapter before I'm forced to do an ad break. So, as a friendly reminder between chapters, if you're new here, hello, I'm Vexen Cat. Be sure to hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is that you need to enjoy the story. Also, hi teeth! Thus far, indeed. I think the discourse between Professor Porter and Mr. Philander are always going to be entertaining little side notes in the story, just because the sheer lexicon of language these two have, and them both being erudite scholars and knowledgeable in both history and I'm assuming any number of subjects.
Don't forget to stretch!
Time to stretch. Yeah, you're onto something. Tut tut. Yeah, there has been some language in this.
Drink water.
You got it.
Become moist.
There has been some language. Moist. There has been some language in this entire book that I have not seen contextually in ages. It feels like something that I would have read, years and years and years ago. It's so antiquated. It is so scholarly. It is so very quintessentially British coded. It's beautiful, but it's just like, wow, they've come so far from speaking in these very obscure sesquipedalian language words to, proper English and conversing. Of course, these would have been what I think the term is toffs. Don't quote me on that. Fallen, you'll have to, teach me if that was the correct word. But these are, scholars, independently wealthy, potentially professors in a museum, very well thought of, very socialite-esque, I don't know, where they all get around and talk about weird scientific subjects over cigars and port, I imagine, is how I picture them. Alright, so we are about to start chapter 17, so settle in, be sure to hydrate, grab whatever you need, and I will stop rambling. Oh, while I'm thinking about it, Tiger Fae, for those of you not familiar, I have a couple of different friends in the audience, in the library. I gave a shout out to Fallen earlier. Let's give one out to Tiger Fae as well, who is adorably one of the most talented artists that I have gotten the pleasure of spending time with. Dickens Pickwick Papers. Oh, I could see that. God, I haven't thought about it. Yeah, in a dog's age. Let's see how long it takes before it gets the actual shout out. Do 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 do. There it is.
We're halfway there.
Oh, the first model. So the very first time I ever saw Tiger Fae, this was the model I think that they were using.
Are you happy that you got me to
albeit
do it?
I believe they were playing a game at the time.
By the way, Silly, if you're still here, do you want to join the chat or not right now? Just let me know.
And I do believe that is Drift Loon, another creator on Twitch that they are currently doing a sketch. Or was it an emote? It might have been an emote. I'm not 100% sure. But if you're not already following Tiger Fae, be sure to check them out. They are an amazing creator and they do a variety of art, gaming, chill, just hang out, just chatting streams. Good vibes all told. So we are on to chapter 17. Let's see. There we go. Chapter 17, Burials. As it was now quite light, The party, none of whom had eaten or slept since the previous morning, began to bestir themselves to prepare food. The mutineers of the Arrow had landed a small supply of dried meats, canned soups, and vegetables, crackers, flour, tea, and coffee for the 5 they had marooned, and these were hurriedly drawn upon to satisfy the craving of long-famished appetites. The next task was to make the cabin habitable, and to this end it was decided to at once remove the gruesome relics of the tragedy which had taken place there on some bygone day. Professor Porter and Mr. Philander were deeply interested in examining the skeletons. The 2 larger, they stated, had belonged to a male and female of one of the to a male and a female. The smallest skeleton was given but passing attention, as its location in the crib left no doubt as to its having been the infant offspring of this unhappy couple. They should have looked more closely. As they were preparing the skeleton of the man for burial, Clayton discovered a massive ring, which had evidently encircled the man's finger at the time of his death.
Olmontis VT just raided with 12 viewers.
Oh, geez. Hey, everybody. Welcome in. Thanks for the raid. Excellent. Excellent. Hello. Probably should close out of that. There we go. I just rated myself technically. Welcome in, everyone. If you haven't seen them before, this is Almontis, which I should do a shout out right now. Shout out Almontis, who, there we go, is another erudite streamer here on Twitch. I think they were doing a calligraphy stream today, if memory serves.
I think it
when they had the PNG tuber.
is not a good idea. I'm
99% sure I deleted this.
I already have to worry about social credit in my own country. I don't need to worry about
Guru,
Chinese social credit right now.
The website that polls these clips, I'm
That's
not
a whole extra
entirely
headache.
sure what the algorithm it uses to poll them. Technically, the source code is supposed to be recent clips, and that was far from recent. Very odd, very strange. But, dear raiders, hello, I am Vexing Cat. If you're not familiar with my content, I am a tiger librarian. I read classic literature and poetry, and occasionally play various games. But yes, was doing calligraphy, talking about Ursula Le Guin and Oshinoko. Interesting. I am currently reading Tarzan of the Apes, which is the first of 24 novels, full-length novels, about Tarzan by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Let me see here. For you lovely raiders, if you have a moment, be sure to hydrate, caffeinate, stretch, do whatever you need to relax and enjoy the story. And I shall continue from which, oh, sweet Jesus.
Foxy Shroom Witch just raided with 42 viewers.
My goodness.
Hokyo Dreams just
Shroom
followed.
raid, indeed. Happy Friday. Welcome in, raiders. Hi. I was just saying, because I was just raided 30 seconds ago. Hello, I am Vexing Cat. I am a tiger librarian. I am currently reading Tarzan of the Apes, the first novel of 24 by Edgar Rice Burroughs. I am shooketh. Foxy Shroom Witch is an amazing ASMR streamer. They have the binaural a microphone, and they do all the cool sound effects. They're really super chill as well. If you guys haven't checked them out before, I'm pretty sure I can do a shout out. Foxy There we are. Foxy, thank you for the raid. My goodness, that's twice in one day.
You know what? I'm gonna sing again. Y'all gonna have to deal with me singing. That's what y'all subscribe.
They really have one of the coolest
Right?
models.
It's because I sing. It's because I sing, right? Too bad. Y'all get that. Y'all get that. Y'all get that. Y'all get it.
It's all about the details, like around the collar, the embroidery, the mushroom spores interspersed upon their ears and tail. 10 out of 10. Thank you so much. I am getting loved on, nerd, as I am wont to say. Thank you so much, all of you wonderful raiders. I hope that you're able to relax and enjoy the story. I'm continuing on from the morning after the party. Thank you for the follow. After the party has
Wade
been
will just
reunited,
followed.
so we have Lydia Porter, Esmeralda, the maid, Professor Porter, Mr. Philander, and Clayton have all been reunited at the hard work of Tarzan, because Tarzan had to fetch Clayton, and then he had to go and fetch the two old men and bring them back to the ladies. So they have been set aside from the ship, the Arrow, and now are currently living in the abode of Tarzan's long since passed parents. So, and they're going to try and make it habitable, but first we shall have breakfast. Picking it up to examine it, Clayton gave a cry of astonishment, for the ring bore the crest of the House of Greystoke. Oh, I think I should probably read that last paragraph again. Lost my train of thought. As they were preparing the skeleton of the man for burial, Clayton discovered a massive ring which had evidently encircled the man's finger at the time of his death, for one of the slender bones of the hand still lay within the golden bauble. Picking it up to examine it, Clayton gave a cry of astonishment, for the ring bore the crest of the House of Greystoke. And Clayton is from the House of Greystoke. At the same time, Jane Porter discovered the books in the cupboard, and on opening to the flyleaf of one of them saw the name John Clayton, London. In a second book, which she hurriedly examined with the single name Greystoke. "Why, Mr. Clayton," she cried, "what does this mean? Here are the names of some of your own people in these books." "And here," he replied gravely, "is the great ring of the House of Greystoke, which has been lost since my uncle John Clayton, the former Lord Greystoke, disappeared, presumably lost at sea." "But how do you account for these things being here in this savage African jungle?" exclaimed the girl. There is but one way to account for it, Miss Porter," said Clayton. "The late Lord Greystoke was not drowned. He died here, in this cabin, and this poor thing upon the floor is all that is mortal of him." "Then this must have been Lady Greystoke," said Jane Porter reverently, indicating the poor mass of bones upon the bed. "The beautiful Lady Alice," replied Clayton, "of whose many virtues and remarkable personal charms I often have heard my mother and father speak. Poor, unhappy lady," he murmured sadly. With deep reverence and solemnity, the bodies of the late Lord and Lady Greystoke were buried beside their little African cabin, and between them was placed the tiny skeleton of the baby of Kala, the ape. As Mr. Philander was placing the frail bones of the infant in a bit of sailcloth, he examined the skull minutely. Then he called Professor Porter to his side, and the two argued in low tones for several minutes. Most remarkable, said Professor Porter. Bless me, said Mr. Philander. We must acquaint Mr. Clayton with our discovery at once. Tut, tut, Mr. Philander, tut, tut, remonstrated Professor Archimedes Q. Porter. Let the dead past bury its dead. And so the white-haired old man repeated the burial service over this strange grave, while his four companions stood with bowed and uncovered heads about him. From the trees, Tarzan of the Apes watched the solemn ceremony, but most of all he watched the sweet face and graceful figure of Jane Porter. In his savage, untutored breast, new emotions were stirring. He could not fathom them. He wondered why he felt so great an interest in these people, why he had gone to such pains to save the three men, but he did not wonder why he had torn Sabor from the tender flesh of the strange girl. Surely the men were stupid, and ridiculous, and cowardly. Even Manu, the monkey, was more intelligent than they. If these were creatures of his own kind, he was doubtful if his past pride in blood was warranted. But the girl... that was a different matter. He did not reason here. He knew that he was created to be protected, and that he was created to protect her. He wondered why they had dug a great hole in the ground merely to bury dry bones. Surely there was no sense in that. No one wanted to steal dry bones. Had there been meat upon them, he could have understood, for thus alone might one keep his meat from Dango the hyena and the other robbers of the jungle. When the grave had been filled with earth, the little party turned back toward the cabin. And Esmeralda, still weeping copiously for the two she had never heard of before today, and who had been dead 20 years, chanced to glance toward the harbor. Instantly her tears ceased. "Look at them low-down white trash out there," she shrilled, pointing toward the Arrow. "They alls a desecrating us right here on this year perverted island." And sure enough, the Arrow was being worked toward the open sea, slowly through the harbor's entrance. "They promised to leave us firearms and ammunition," said Clayton. "The merciless beasts." "It is the work of that fellow they call Snipes, I am sure," said Jane Porter. "King was a scoundrel, but he had a little sense of humanity. If they had not killed him, I know that he would have seen that we were properly provided for before they left us to our fate." "I regret that they did not visit us before sailing," said Professor Porter. "I had proposed requesting them to leave the treasure with us, as I shall be a ruined man if that is lost." Jane Porter looked at her father sadly. "Never mind, dear," she said. "It wouldn't have done any good, because it is solely for the treasure that they killed their officers and landed us upon this awful shore." "Tut, tut, child, tut, tut," replied Professor Porter. "You are a good child, but inexperienced in practical matters." And Professor Porter turned and walked slowly away toward the jungle, his hands clasped beneath his long coat-tails and his eyes bent upon the ground. His daughter watched him with a pathetic smile upon her lips, and then, turning to Mr. Philander, she whispered, "Please don't let him wander off again as he did yesterday. We depend upon you, you know, to keep a close watch upon him." "He becomes more difficult to handle each day," replied Mr. Philander with a sigh and a shake of his head. "I presume he is now off to report to the directors of the zoo that one of their lions was at large last night. Oh, Miss Jane, you don't know what I have to contend with." "Yes, I do, Mr. Philander, but while we all love him, you alone are best fitted to manage him. For, regardless of what he may say to you, he respects your great learning, and therefore has immense confidence in your judgment. The poor dear cannot differentiate between erudition and wisdom. Mr. Philander, with a mildly puzzled expression on his face, turned to pursue Professor Porter, and in his mind he was revolving the question of whether he should feel complimented or aggrieved at Miss Porter's rather backhanded compliment. Tarzan had seen the consternation depicted upon the faces of the little group as they witnessed the departure of the Arrow. So, as the ship was a wonderful novelty to him in addition, he determined to hasten out to the point of land at the north of the harbor's mouth and obtain a nearer view of the boat, as well as to learn, if possible, the direction of its flight. Swinging through the trees with great speed, he reached the point but a moment after the ship had passed out of the harbor, so that he obtained an excellent view of the wonders of this strange floating house. There were some 20 men running hither and thither about the deck, pulling and hauling on ropes. A light land breeze was blowing, and the ship had been worked through the harbor's mouth under scant sail, but now that they had cleared the point, every available shred of canvas was being spread that she might stand out to sea as handily as possible. Tarzan watched the graceful movements of the ship in rapt admiration and longed to be aboard her. Presently his keen eyes caught the faintest suspicion of smoke on the far northern horizon, and he wondered over the cause of such a thing out on the great water. At about the same time, the lookout on the Arrow must have discerned it, for in a few minutes Tarzan saw the sails being shifted and shortened. The ship came about, and presently he knew that she was beating back toward land. A man at the bows was constantly heaving into the sea a rope to the end of which a small object was fastened. Tarzan wondered what the purpose of this action might be. At last the ship came up directly into the wind, the anchor was lowered, down came the sails, and there was great scurrying about on deck. A boat was lowered, and in it a great chest was placed. Then a dozen sailors bent to the oars and pulled rapidly toward the point where Tarzan crouched in the branches of a tree. In the stern of the boat, as it drew nearer, Tarzan saw the rat-faced man. It was but a few minutes later that the boat touched the beach. The men jumped out and lifted the great chest to the sand. They were on the north side of the point, so that their presence was concealed from those at the cabin. The men argued angrily for a moment. Then the rat-faced one, with several companions, ascended the low bluff on which stood the tree that concealed Tarzan. They looked about for several minutes. "Here is a good place," said the rat-faced sailor, indicating a spot beneath Tarzan's tree. "It is as good as any," replied one of his companions. "If they catch us with the treasure aboard, it will all be confiscated anyway. We might as well bury it here on the chance that some of us will escape the gallows to come back and enjoy it later." The rat-faced one now called to the men who had remained at the boat, and they came slowly up the bank, carrying picks and shovels. "Hurry, you!" cried Snipes. "Stow it!" retorted one of the men in a surly tone. "You are no admiral, you bleep, bleep, shrimp." Can only imagine what words they would have said. "I'm captain here, though. I'll have you to understand, you swab," shrieked Snipes with a volley of frightful oaths. "Steady, boys," cautioned one of the men who had not spoken before. "It ain't going to get us nothing by fighting amongst ourselves." "Right enough," replied the sailor, who had resented Snipes' autocratic tones. But by the same token, it ain't a-goin' to get nobody nothing to put on airs in this bloomin' company neither. You fellows dig here, said Snipes, indicating a spot beneath the tree, and while you're diggin', Peter kin be a-making of a map of the location so we can find it again. You, Tom, and Bill, take a couple more down and fetch up the chest. What are you going to do? Asked he of the previous altercation. Just, boss? Get busy there, growled Snipes. You didn't think your captain was a-going to dig with a shovel, did you? The men all looked up angrily. None of them liked Snipes, and his disagreeable show of authority since he had murdered King, the real head and ringleader of the mutineers, had only added fuel to the flames of their hatred. Do you mean to say that you don't intend to take a shovel and lend a hand with this work? Your shoulder's not hurted so all fired bad as that, said Tarrant, the sailor who had before spoken. Not by a sight, replied Snipes, fingering the butt of his revolver nervously. Then by God, replied Tarrant, if you won't take a shovel, you'll take a pickaxe. With the words, he raised his pick above his head, and with a mighty blow buried the point in Snipes' brow. What? That escalated so quickly. With the words, he raised his pick above his head, and with a mighty blow buried the point in Snipes' brain. Yes. 0 to 100. For a moment the men stood silently looking at the result of their fellow's grim humor. Then one of them spoke. Served the skunk jolly well right, he said. One of the others commenced to ply his pick to the ground. The soil was soft, and he threw aside the pick and grasped a shovel. Then the others joined him. There was no further comment on the killing, but the men worked in a better frame of mind than they had since Snipes had assumed command. They're like, all right. It's just moving on. Like, they hated him so much that, like, him dying suddenly made no difference. Woof. When they had a trench of ample size to bury the chest, Tarrant suggested that they enlarge it and inter Snipes' body on top of the chest. And it might help. It might help fool any as happened to be digging hereabouts, he explained. The others saw the cunning of the suggestion, and so the trench was lengthened to accommodate the corpse, and in the center a deeper hole was excavated for the box, which was first wrapped in sailcloth and then lowered to its place, which brought its top about a foot below the bottom of the grave. Earth was shoveled in and tramped down about the chest until the bottom of the grave showed level and uniform. Two of the men rolled the fat-faced corpse unceremoniously into the grave, after first stripping it of its weapons and various other articles which the several members of the party coveted for their own. They then filled the grave with earth and tramped upon it until it would hold no more. The balance of the loose earth was thrown far and wide, and a mass of dead undergrowth spread in as natural a manner as possible over the new-made grave to obliterate all signs of the ground having been disturbed. Their work done, the sailors returned to the small boat and pulled off rapidly toward the Arrow. The breeze had increased considerably, and as the smoke upon the horizon was now plainly discernible in considerable volume, the mutineers lost no time in getting under full sail and bearing away toward the southwest. Tarzan, an interested spectator of all that had taken place, sat speculating on the strange actions of these peculiar creatures. Men were indeed more foolish and more cruel than the beasts of the jungle. How fortunate was he who lived in the peace and security of the great forest. Tarzan wondered what the chest they had buried contained. If they did not want it, why did they not merely throw it into the water? That would have been much easier. Ah, he thought, but they do want it. They have hidden it here because they intend returning for it later. Tarzan dropped to the ground and commenced to examine the earth about the excavation. He was looking to see if these creatures had dropped anything which he might like to own. Soon he discovered a spade hidden by the underbrush which they had laid upon the grave. He seized it and attempted to use it as he had seen the sailors do. It was awkward work and hurt his bare feet, but he persevered until he had partially uncovered the body. This he dragged from the grave and laid to one side, unceremoniously. Then he continued digging until he had unearthed the chest. This also he dragged to the side of the corpse. Then he filled in the smaller hole below the grave, replaced the body and earth around and above it, covered it over with underbrush, and returned to the chest. Honestly, very clever. 4 sailors had sweated beneath the burden of its weight. Tarzan of the Apes picked it up as though it had been an empty packing case, and with the spade slung to his back by a piece of rope, carried it off into the densest part of the jungle. He could not well negotiate the trees with this awkward burden, but he kept to the trails, and so made fairly good time. For several hours he traveled a little north of east until he came to an impenetrable wall of matted and tangled vegetation. Then he took to the lower branches, and in another 15 minutes he emerged into the amphitheater of the apes, where they met in council, or to celebrate the rites of the Dum-Dum. Near the center of the clearing, and not far from the drum or altar, he commenced to dig. This was harder work than turning up the freshly excavated earth at the grave, but Tarzan of the Apes was persevering, and so he kept at his labor until he was rewarded by seeing a hole sufficiently deep to receive the chest and effectually hide it from view. Why had he gone to all this labor without knowing the value of the contents of the chest? Tarzan of the Apes had a man's figure and a man's brain, but he was an ape by training and environment. His brain told him that the chest contained something valuable, or the men would not have hidden it. His training had taught him to imitate whatever was new and unusual, and now the natural curiosity, which is as common to men as to apes, prompted him to open the chest and examine its contents. But the heavy lock and massive iron bands baffled both his cunning and his immense strength, so that he was compelled to bury the chest without having his curiosity satisfied. By the time Tarzan had hunted his way back to the vicinity of the cabin, feeding as he went, it was quite dark. Within the little building a light was burning, for Clayton had found an unopened tin of oil, which had stood intact for 20 years, a part of the supplies left with the Claytons by Black Michael. Weird. The lamps also were still usable, and thus the interior of the cabin appeared as bright as day to the astonished Tarzan. He had often wondered at the exact purpose of the lamps. His reading and the pictures had told him what they were, but he had no idea of how they could be made to produce the wondrous sunlight that some of his pictures had portrayed them as diffusing upon all surrounding objects. As he approached the window nearest the door, he saw that the cabin had been divided into 2 rooms by a rough partition of boughs and sailcloth. In the front room were the 3 men, the 2 older deep in argument, while the younger, tilted back against the wall on an improvised stool, was deeply engrossed in reading one of Tarzan's books. Tarzan was not particularly interested in the men, however, so he sought the other window. There was the girl. How beautiful her features, how delicate her snowy skin. She was writing at Tarzan's own table beneath the window. Upon a pile of grasses at the far side of the room lay the woman, the maid. lay the maid asleep. For an hour Tarzan feasted his eyes upon her while she wrote. How he longed to speak to her, but he dared not attempt it, for he was convinced that, like the young man, she would not understand him, and he feared too that he might frighten her away. At length she arose, leaving her manuscript upon the table. She went to the bed, upon which had been spread several layers of soft grasses. These she rearranged. Then she loosened the soft mass of golden hair which crowned her head, like a shimmering waterfall turned to burnished metal by a dying sun. It fell about her oval face in waving lines. Below her waist it tumbled. Tarzan was spellbound. Then she extinguished the lamp, and all within the cabin was wrapped in Cimmerian darkness. Still, Tarzan watched without. Creeping close beneath the window, he waited, listening. For half an hour at last he was rewarded by the sounds of the regular breathing within, which denotes sleep. Cautiously, he intruded his hand between the meshes of the lattice until his whole arm was within the cabin. Carefully, he felt upon the desk. At last he grasped the manuscript upon which Jane Porter had been writing, and as cautiously withdrew his arm and hand, holding the precious treasure. Tarzan folded the sheets into a small parcel, which he tucked into the quiver with his arrows. Then he melted away into the jungle as softly and as noiselessly as a shadow. Dun dun dun. Oh my goodness. All right. So we are very quickly upon an ad. So we're going to go ahead and do a quick ad break. I'll use the restroom. My water bottle is still quite full, so I'm not terribly worried about that. But we'll go on to a quick be right back. Do an ad during that 3-minute break.
I need
when
more
come back,
caffeine.
we'll get
My
started
blood
on
is
the
not
next
thin enough.
chapter. I will do my best. I have some coffee left. Not much, but some. All right. Everyone, hang tight. I will be back as soon as possible. It's snack time.
Don't forget to stretch!
There we go. And we're back. I hope everyone had a good short break and the ads weren't too bad while I was gone. Alright, we are on to chapter 18. And welcome back, anybody that stayed. I know during the ad break it can be a little annoying, but we do our best. So we are on to chapter 18, The Jungle Toll. Early the following morning, Tarzan awoke, and the first thought of the new day, as the last of yesterday, was of the wonderful writing which lay hidden in his quiver. No one would fault you for falling asleep, Fallen. Hurriedly, he brought it forth, hoping against hope that he had read what the beautiful that he could read what the beautiful girl, my goodness. So, the language in this book is struggle. Hurriedly, he brought it forth, hoping against hope that he could read what the beautiful girl had written there the preceding evening. At the first glance he suffered the bitterest disappointment of his whole life. Never before had he so yearned for anything as now, as he did for the ability to interpret a message from the golden-haired divinity who had come so suddenly and so unexpectedly into his life. What if the message were not intended for him? What if the message were not intended for him? It was an expression of her thoughts. And that was all sufficient for Tarzan of the Apes. And now, to be baffled by strange, uncouth characters, the like of which he had never seen before. Why, they even tipped in the opposite direction from all that he had ever examined, either in printed books or the difficult script of the few letters he had found. Even the little bugs of the black book were familiar friends, though their arrangement meant nothing to him. But these bugs were new and unheard of. For 20 minutes he pored over them, when suddenly they commenced to take familiar, though distorted, shapes. Ah, they were his old friends, but badly crippled. Okay. Then he began to make out a word here and a word there. His heart leaped for joy. He could read it, and he would. In another half-hour he was progressing rapidly, but for an exceptional word now and again he found it very plain sailing. Here is what he read. West coast of Africa, about 10 degrees south latitude. So, Mr. Clayton says, February 3, 1909. Dearest Hazel, it seems foolish to write you a letter that you may never see, but I simply must tell somebody of our awful experiences since we sailed from Europe on the ill-fated Arrow. If we never return to civilization, as now seems only too likely, this will at least prove a brief record of the events which led up to our final fate, whatever it may be. As you know, we were supposed to have set out upon a scientific expedition to the Congo. Papa was presumed to entertain some wondrous theory of an unthinkably ancient civilization, the remains of which lay buried somewhere in the Congo Valley. But after we were well under sail, the truth came out. It seems that an old bookworm who has a book and a curios shop in Baltimore discovered between the leaves of a very old Spanish manuscript a letter written in 1550 detailing the adventures of a crew of mutineers of a Spanish galleon bound from Spain to South America with a vast treasure of doubloons and pieces of 8. I suppose, for they certainly sound weird and piratey. The writer had been one of the crew, and the letter was to his son, who was, at the very time the letter was written, master of a Spanish merchantman. Many years had elapsed since the events the letter narrated had transpired, and the old man had become a respected citizen of an obscure Spanish town. But the love of gold was still so strong upon him that he risked all to acquaint his son with the means of attaining fabulous wealth
Kitten
for
Girl
them both.
2024 just followed.
Aw, thank you for following, Kitten Girl. Many years had elapsed since the events the letter narrated and had words. Many years had elapsed since the events the letter narrated and had transpired, and the old man had become a respected citizen of an obscure Spanish town. But the love of gold was still so strong upon him that he risked all to acquaint his son with the means of attaining fabulous wealth for them both. The writer told how, but a week out from Spain, the crew had mutinied and murdered every officer and man who opposed them. But they defeated their own ends by this very act, for there was none left competent to navigate a ship at sea. They were blown hither and thither for 2 months, until sick and dying of scurvy, starvation, and thirst, they had been wrecked on a small islet. The galleon was washed high upon the beach, where she went to pieces, but not before the survivors, who numbered but 10 souls, had rescued one of the great chests of treasure. This they buried well up on the island, and for 3 years they lived there in constant hope of being rescued. One by one they sickened and died, until only one man was left, the writer of the letter. The men had built a boat from the wreckage of the galleon, but having no idea where the island was located, they had not dared to put to sea. When all were dead except himself, however, the awful loneliness so weighed upon the mind of the sole survivor that he could endure it no longer, and choosing to risk death upon the open sea rather than madness on the lonely isle, he set sail in his little boat after nearly a year of solitude. Fortunately, he sailed due north, and within a week was in the track of the Spanish merchantmen plying between the West Indies and Spain, and was picked up by one of these vessels homeward bound. The story he told was merely one of shipwreck in which all but a few had perished, the balance except himself dying after they reached the island. He did not mention the mutiny or the chest of buried treasure. The master of the merchantmen assured him that from the position at which they had picked him up and the prevailing winds for the past week, he could have been on no other island than one of the Cape Verde group, which lie off the west coast of Africa in about 16 degrees or 17 degrees north latitude. His letter described the island minutely, as well as the location of the treasure, and was accompanied by the crudest, funniest little old map you ever saw, with trees and rocks all marked by scrawly X's to show the exact spot where the treasure had been buried. When Papa explained the real nature of the expedition, my heart sank, for I know so well how visionary and impractical the poor dear has always been, that I feared that he had again been duped, especially when he told me that he had paid $1,000 for the letter and map. To add to my distress, I learned that he had borrowed $10,000 more from Robert Candler and had given his notes for the amount. Mr. Candler had asked for no security, and you know, dearie, what that will mean for me if Papa cannot meet them. Oh, how I detest that man. We all tried to look at the bright side of things, but Mr. Philander and Mr. Clayton, he joined us in London just for the adventure. Both felt as skeptical as I. Well, to make a long story short, we found the island and the treasure. A great iron-bound oak chest, wrapped in many layers of oiled sailcloth, and as strong and firm as when it had been buried nearly 200 years ago. It was simply filled with gold coin, and was so heavy that 4 men bent beneath its weight. Meanwhile, Tarzan's just lugging this thing around like it's nobody's business. I suppose it's all relative. The horrid thing seems to bring nothing but murder and misfortune to those who have to do with it. For 3 days after we sailed from Cape Verde Islands, our own crew mutinied and killed every one of their officers. Oh, it was the most terrifying experience one could imagine. I cannot even write of it. They were going to kill us too, but one of them, the leader, a man named King, would not let them, and so they sailed south along the coast to a lonely spot where they found a good harbor, and here they landed and have left us. Well, given the option of dying or being abandoned, I know which I'll take too. They sailed away with the treasure today, but Mr. Clayton says they will meet with a fate similar to the mutineers of the ancient galleon, because King, the only man aboard who knew aught of navigation, was murdered on the beach by one of the men the day we landed. I wish you could know Mr. Clayton. He is the dearest fellow imaginable, and unless I am mistaken, he has fallen very much in love with poor little me. He is the only son of Lord Greystoke, and some day will inherit the title and estates. Will he? In addition, he is wealthy in his own right, but the fact that he is going to be an English lord makes me very sad. You know what my sentiments have always been relative to American girls who married titled foreigners. Oh, if he were only a plain American gentleman. Oh, you poor thing. But it isn't his fault, poor fellow, and in everything except birth he would do credit to my darling old country, and that is the greatest compliment I know how to pay any man. We have had the most weird experiences since we were landed here. Papa and Mr. Philander lost in the jungle and chased by a real lion. Mr. Clayton lost and attacked twice by a wild beast. Esmeralda and I cornered in an old cabin by a perfectly awful man-eating lioness. Oh, it was simply terrifical, as Esmeralda would say. But the strangest part of it all is the wonderful creature who rescued us. I have not seen him, but Mr. Clayton and Papa and Mr. Philander have, and they say that he is a perfectly godlike man, tanned to a dusky brown, with the strength of a wild elephant, the agility of a monkey, and the bravery of a lion. He speaks no English and vanishes as quickly and as mysteriously after. he has performed some valorous deed, as though he were a disembodied spirit. Then we have another weird neighbor who printed a beautiful sign in English and tacked it on the door of his cabin, which we have preempted, warning us to destroy none of his belongings and signing himself Tarzan of the Apes. We have never seen him, though we think he is about, for one of the sailors who was going to shoot Mr. Clayton in the back received a spear in his shoulder from some unseen hand in the jungle. Hey, Starifina, welcome in. The sailors left us but a meager supply of food, so as we have only a single revolver with but 3 cartridges left in it, we do not know how we can procure meat, though Mr. Philander says that we can exist indefinitely on the wild fruit and nuts which abound in the jungle. I am very tired now, so I shall go to my funny bed of grasses which Mr. Clayton gathered for me, but will add to this from day to day as things happen. Lovingly, Jane Porter. To Hazel Strong, Baltimore. MD. I forget what that is. Might use my big brain for a second. Maryland? Is MD Maryland? It must be. I'm guessing so. Alright. I believe so. Good call, Valis. Tarzan sat in a brown study for a long time. After he finished reading the letter, it was filled with so many new and wonderful things that his brain was in a whirl as he attempted to digest them all. So they did not know that he was Tarzan of the Apes. He would tell them. In his tree he had constructed a rude shelter of leaves and boughs, beneath which, protected from the rain, he had placed the few treasures brought from the cabin. Among these were some pencils. He took one, and beneath Jane Porter's signature he wrote, "I am Tarzan of the Apes." He thought that would be sufficient. Later he would return the letter to the cabin. In the matter of food, thought Tarzan, they had no need to worry. He would provide, and he did. The next morning Jane Porter found her missing letter in the exact spot from which it had disappeared 2 nights before. She was mystified, but when she saw the printed words beneath her signature, she felt a cold, clammy chill run up her spine. She showed the letter, or rather the last sheet with the signature, to Clayton. "Thank you for the head pats." "And to think," she said, "that uncanny thing was probably watching me all the time that I was writing. Ooh! It makes me shudder just to think of it." "But he must be friendly," reassured Clayton, "for he has returned your letter, nor did he offer to harm you, and unless I am mistaken, he left a very substantial memento of his friendship outside the cabin door last night, for I just found the carcass of a wild boar there as I came out." From then on, scarcely a day passed that did not bring its offering of game or other food. Sometimes it was a young deer. Again, a quantity of strange cooked food, cassava cakes pilfered from the village of Mabonga, or a boar, or leopard, and once a lion. Tarzan derived the greatest pleasure of his life in hunting meat for these strangers. It seemed to him that no pleasure on earth could compare with laboring for the welfare and protection of the beautiful girl. Some day he would venture into the camp in daylight and talk with these people through the medium of little bugs which were familiar to them and to Tarzan. but he found it difficult to overcome the timidity of the wild thing of the forest, and so day followed day without seeing a fulfillment of his good intentions. The party in the camp, emboldened by familiarity, wandered further and yet further into the jungle in search of nuts and fruit. Scarcely a day passed that they did find Professor Porter straying in his preoccupied indifference toward the jaws of death. Professor. Mr. Samuel T. Philander, never what one might call robust, was worn to the shadow of a shadow through the ceaseless worry and mental distraction resultant from his Herculean efforts to safeguard the professor. That poor man. A month passed. Tarzan had finally determined to visit the camp by daylight. It was early afternoon. Clayton had wandered to the point of the harbor's mouth to look for passing vessels. Here he kept a great mass of wood, high piled, ready to be ignited as a signal should a steamer or a sail top the far horizon. Professor Porter was wandering along the beach, south of the camp, with Mr. Philander at his elbow, urging him to turn his steps back before the two became again the sport of some savage beast. The others gone, Jane Porter and Esmeralda had wandered into the jungle to gather fruit, and in their search were led further and further from the cabin. Tarzan waited in silence before the door of the little house until they should return. His thoughts were of the beautiful girl. They were always of her now. He wondered if she would fear him, and the thought all but caused him to relinquish his plan. He was rapidly becoming impatient of her return, that he might feast his eyes upon her and be near her, perhaps touch her. The ape-man knew no god, but he was as near to worshipping his divinity as mortal man ever comes to worship. While he waited, he passed the time printing a message to her. Whether he intended giving it to her, he himself could not have told, but he took infinite pleasure in seeing his thoughts expressed in print, in which he was not so uncivilized after all. He wrote, "You're very welcome, Lasada. Have a good night's rest. And happy time zones. I am Tarzan of the Apes. I want you. I am yours. You are mine. We will live here together always in my house. I will bring you the best fruits, the tenderest deer, the finest meats that roam the jungle. I will hunt for you. I am the greatest of the jungle hunters. I will fight for you. I am the mightiest of the jungle fighters. You are Jane Porter. I saw it in your letter. When you see this, you will know that it is for you that the Tarzan of the Apes loves you. And that Tarzan of the Apes loves you." I'm surprised that he can understand such an abstract concept as love just from learning from picture books. Interesting. As he stood, straight as a young man by the door, waiting after he had finished the message, there came to his keen ears a familiar sound. It was the passing of a great ape through the lower branches of the forest. For an instant he listened intently, and then from the jungle came the agonized scream of a woman. And Tarzan of the Apes, dropping his first love letter upon the ground, shot like a panther into the forest. Clayton also heard the scream, and Professor Porter and Mr. Philander, and in a few minutes they came panting to the cabin, calling out to each other a volley of excited questions as they approached. A glance within confirmed their worst fears. Jane Porter and Esmeralda were not there. Instantly, Clayton, followed by the two old men, plunged into the jungle, calling the girl's name aloud. For half an hour they stumbled on, until Clayton, by merest chance, came upon the prostrate form of Esmeralda. He stooped beside her, feeling for her pulse and then listening for her heartbeats. She lived. He shook her. Esmeralda! He shrieked in her ear. Esmeralda, for God's sake, where is Miss Porter? What has happened, Esmeralda? Slowly, the woman opened her eyes. She saw Clayton. She saw the jungle about her. Oh, Gabrielle! She screamed and fainted again. By this time, Professor Porter and Mr. Philander had come up. What shall we do, Mr. Clayton? Asked the old professor. Where shall we look? God could not have been so cruel as to take my little girl away from me now. We must arouse Esmeralda first, replied Clayton. She can tell us what has happened. Esmeralda, he cried again, shaking the woman roughly by the shoulder. Oh, Gabrielle, I wants to die, cried the poor woman, but with eyes fast closed. Let me die, dear Lord, but don't let me be that awful place again. What for you send the devil round after poor old Esmeralda? She ain't done nothing to nobody, Lord. Holmes, honest she ain't. She perfectly indecent, Lord. Yes, indeed she is. Come, Esmeralda, cried Clayton. The Lord isn't here, Mr. Clayton. Open your eyes. Oh, the Lord isn't here, Mr. Clayton. Open your eyes. Esmeralda did as she was bade. Oh, Gabrielle, thank the Lord, she said. Where's Miss Porter? What happened? Questioned Clayton. Ain't Miss Jane here? Cried Esmeralda, sitting up with wonderful celerity for one of her bulk. Oh, Lord, Lord, now I remembers, it done must have took her away. And the woman commenced to sob and wail her lamentations. What took her away? Cried Professor Porter. A great big giant all covered with hair. A gorilla, Esmeralda? Questioned Mr. Philander, and the three men scarcely breathed as he voiced the horrible thought. I done thought it was the devil, but I guess it must have been one of them gorilla fants. Oh, my poor baby, my poor little honey. And again Esmeralda broke into uncontrollable sobbing. Clayton immediately began to look about for tracks, but he could find nothing save a confusion of trampled grasses in the close vicinity, and his woodcraft was too meager for the translation of what he did see. All the balance of the day they sought through the jungle, but as night drew on they were forced to give up in despair and hopelessness. For they did not even know in what direction the thing had borne Jane Porter. It was long after dark ere they reached the cabin, and a sad and grief-stricken party it was that sat silently within the little structure. Professor Porter finally broke the silence. His tones were no longer those of an erudite pedant theorizing upon the abstract and unknowable, but those of a man of action, determined, but tinged also by a note of indescribable hopelessness and grief which wrung an answering pang from Clayton's heart. I shall lie down now, said the old man, and try to sleep. Early tomorrow, so soon as it is light, I shall take what food I can carry and continue the search until I have found Jane. I will not return without her. His companions did not reply at once. Each was immersed in his own sorrowful thoughts, and each knew, as did the old professor, what the last words meant. Professor Porter would never return from the jungle. Oof. I shall go with you, of course, he said. I'm sorry. At length Clayton arose and laid his hand gently upon Professor Porter's bent old shoulder. I shall go with you, of course, he said. Do not tell me that I need even have said so. I knew that you would wish to go, Mr. Clayton. But you must not. Jane is beyond human assistance now. I simply go that I may face my Maker with her, and know, too, that what was once my dear little girl lies not alone and friendless in the awful jungle. The same vines and leaves will cover us, the same rains beat upon us, and when the spirit of her mother is abroad, it will find us together in death, as it has always found us in life. No, it is I alone who may go, for she was my daughter, all that was left on earth for me to love. I shall go with you, said Clayton simply. The old man looked up, regarding the strong, handsome face of William Cecil Clayton intently. Perhaps he read there the love that lay in the heart beneath, the love for his daughter. He had been too preoccupied with his own scholarly thoughts in the past to consider the little occurrences, the chance words, which would have indicated to a more practical man that these young people were being drawn more and more closely to one another. Now they came back to him, one by one. As you wish, he said. You may count on me also, Mr. Philander. You may count on me also, said Mr. Philander. No, my dear old friend, said Professor Porter, we may not all go. It would be cruelly wicked to leave poor Esmeralda here. Alone, and the three of us would be no more successful than one. There be enough dead things in the cruel forest as it is. Come, let us try to sleep a little. All right, we are between chapters. Let me grab
Drink
that.
water. Become moist.
Okay, I will be hydrated.
Don't forget to stretch!
And I will stretch.
Snack time!
My goodness. Alright. My god. My mods want to make sure that I stay alive. So I will have a piece of cheese. How about that? A little bit of Baby Bell Gouda. This one's not bad. I think I like the white cheddar the best, I think. I didn't know how I would feel about the Monterey Jack, but it's okay. It's okay. As a general rule, I tend to like cheddar anyway, especially like aged white cheddar with salt crystals. 10 out of 10. The best way to have cheese. So we are between chapters, and as a friendly reminder, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack. Oh, you're not familiar? Baby Bell has many flavors. Here we go. Bye, bye, bye. The snack cheese products. So many, they have variety packs. They have original, which they're all covered in red wax. Oh, get some rest, Steve. Thank you for stopping by. They have the low-calorie version, the Gouda, mozzarella, the white cheddar. This is the one I like the most so far. Monterey Jack, and then back to original. Yeah, they have a couple other flavors. I like the big variety pack because it has a lot of different flavors in it all at once. So you've got white cheddar, Monterey Jack, and then the sharp version of the original, which I think is interesting that they don't actually... Well, whatever. Yes, so cheese! Cheese of the hour. Let's see. Here it's just red. That's fair. I think it's an American brand. I don't know. Cheese is cheese. So here's another chapter. After this chapter is over, though, I'll probably have to run an ad break, but I can just sit here and vibe. Just because I am out of snoozes. And I still want to do at least one, maybe two more chapters today. Alright. Oh, look, it's 4:20. Huh. Chapter 19. The Call of the Primitive. Quick lull. There we go. From the time Tarzan left the tribe of great anthropoids in which he had been raised, it was torn by continual strife and discord. Turquoise proved a cruel and capricious king, so that one by one many of the older and weaker apes, upon whom he was particularly prone to vent his brutish nature, took their families and sought the quiet and safety of the far interior. But at last those who remained were driven to desperation by the continued truculence of Turquoise, and it so happened that one of them recalled the parting admonition of Tarzan. If you have a chief who is cruel, do not do as the other apes do, and attempt any one of you to pit yourself against him alone. But instead, let 2 or 3 or 4 of you attack him together. Then, if you will do this, no chief will dare to be other than he should be, for 4 of you can kill any chief who may ever be over you. And the ape who recalled this wise counsel repeated it to several of his fellows, so that when Turquoise returned to the tribe that day, he found a warm reception awaiting him. There were no formalities. As Turquoise reached the group, 5 huge, hairy beasts sprang upon him. At heart, he was an arrant coward, which is the way with bullies among apes as well as among men, so he did not remain to fight and die, but tore himself away from them as quickly as he could and fled into the sheltering boughs of the forest. 2 more attempts he made to rejoin the tribe, but on each occasion he was set upon and driven away. At last he gave it up and turned, foaming with rage and hatred, into the jungle. For several days he wandered aimlessly, nursing his spite and looking for some weak thing on which to vent his pent anger. It was in this state of mind that the horrible, man-like beast, swinging from tree to tree, came suddenly upon 2 women in the jungle. He was right above them when he discovered them. The first intimation Jane Porter had of his presence was when the great hairy body dropped to the earth beside her, and she saw the awful face and the snarling, hideous mouth thrust within a foot of her. One piercing scream escaped her lips as the brute hand clutched her arm. Then she was dragged toward those awful fangs which yawned at her throat, but ere they touched that fair skin, another mood claimed the anthropoid. Okay. Oh, thanks, Kazman. Not very chill, though. Scenario happening. The tribe had kept his woman. The tribe had kept his women. He must find others to replace them. This hairless white ape would be the first of his new household, and so he threw her roughly across his broad, hairy shoulders and leaped back into the trees, bearing Jane Porter away toward a fate 1,000 times worse than death. Esmeralda's scream of terror had mingled once with that of Jane Porter, and then, as Esmeralda's manner under stress of emergency, which required presence of mind, she swooned. But Jane Porter did not once lose consciousness. It is true that that awful face pressing close to hers, and the stench of the foul breath beating upon her nostrils, paralyzed her with terror. But her brain was clear, and she comprehended all that transpired. With what seemed to her marvelous rapidity, the brute bore her through the forest, but still she did not cry out or struggle. The sudden advent of the ape had confused her to such an extent that she thought now that he was bearing her toward the beach. For this reason, she conserved her energies and her voice until she could see that they had approached near enough to the camp to attract the succor she craved. Poor child! Could she but have known it, she was being borne farther and farther into the impenetrable jungle. The scream that had brought Clayton and the two older men stumbling through the undergrowth had led Tarzan of the Apes straight to where Esmeralda lay, but it was not Esmeralda in whom his interest centered. Though, pausing over her, he saw that she was unhurt. For a moment he scrutinized the ground below and the trees above until the ape that was in him by virtue of training and environment combined with the intelligence that was his by right of birth. Sus. Told his wondrous woodcraft the whole story as plainly as though he had seen the thing happen with his own eyes. And then he was gone again into the swaying trees, following the high-flung spoor which no other human eye could have detected, much less translated. At bough's ends, where the anthropoid swings from one tree to another, there is most to mark the trail, but least to point the direction of the quarry, for there the pressure is downward, always toward the small end of the branch, whether the ape be leaving or entering a tree. But nearer the center of the tree, where the signs of passage are fainter, the direction is plainly marked. Here, on this branch, a caterpillar has been crushed by the fugitive's great foot, and Tarzan knows instinctively where the same foot would touch in the next stride. Here, he looks to find a tiny particle of the demolished larva, oft-times not more than a speck of moisture. Again, a minute bit of bark had been upturned by the scraping hand, and the direction of the break indicates the direction of the passage, or some great limb, or the stem of the tree itself has been brushed by the hairy body, and a tiny shred of hair tells him by the direction from which it is wedged beneath the bark that he is on the right trail. Nor does he need to check his speed to catch these seemingly faint records of the fleeing beast. To Tarzan, they stand out boldly against the myriad other scars and bruises and signs upon the leafy way, but strongest of all is the scent. For Tarzan is pursuing up the wind, and his trained nostrils are as sensitive as a hound's. There are those who believe that the lower orders are specially endowed by nature with better olfactory nerves than man, but it is merely a matter of development. Man's survival does not hinge so greatly upon the perfection of his senses. His power to reason has relieved them of many of their duties, and so they have, to some extent, atrophied, as have the muscles which move the ears and scalp merely from disuse. The muscles are there, about your ears and beneath your scalp, and so are the nerves which transmit sensations to your brain, but they are underdeveloped in you because you do not need them. Not so with Tarzan of the Apes. From early infancy, his survival had depended upon acuteness of eyesight, hearing, smell, touch, and a taste far more than upon the more slowly developed organ of reason. The least developed of all in Tarzan was the sense of taste, for he could eat luscious fruits or raw flesh long buried, but with almost equal appreciation. But in that he differed but slightly from more civilized epicures. Almost silently the ape-man sped on in the track of Turquoise and his prey, but the sound of his approach reached the ears of the fleeing beast and spurred it on to greater speed. 3 miles were covered before Tarzan overtook them, and then Turquoise, seeing that further flight was futile, dropped to the ground in a small open glade, that he might turn and fight for his prize, or be free to escape unhampered if he saw that the pursuer was more than a match for him. He still grasped Jane Porter in one great arm as Tarzan bounded like a leopard into the arena which nature had provided for his primeval-like battle. For this primeval-like battle. When Turquoise saw that it was Tarzan who pursued him, he jumped to the conclusion that this was Tarzan's woman, since they were of same kind, hairless, and so he rejoined at this opportunity for double revenge upon his hated enemy. To Jane Porter, the strange apparition of this godlike man was as wine to sick nerves. To Jane Porter, the strange apparition of this godlike man was as wine to sick nerves. What a phrase. From the description which Clayton and her father and Mr. Philander had given her, she knew that it must be the same wonderful creature who had saved them, and she saw in him only a protector and a friend. But as Turquoise pushed her roughly aside to meet Tarzan's charge, and she saw the great proportions of the ape and the mighty muscles and the fierce fangs, her heart quailed. How could any animal vanquish such a mighty antagonist? Like 2 charging bulls they came together, and like 2 wolves sought each other's throat. Against the long canines of the ape was pitted the thin blade of the man's knife. Jane Porter, her lithe, young form flattened against the trunk of a great tree, her hands tight pressed against her rising and falling bosom, and her eyes wide with mingled horror, fascination, fear, and admiration, watched the primordial ape battle with the primeval man for possession of a woman. For her. Oh, Jane. As the great muscles of the man's back and shoulders nodded beneath the tension of his efforts, and the huge biceps and forearm held at bay those mighty tusks, the veil of centuries of civilization and culture was swept from the blurred vision of the Baltimore girl. When the long knife drank deep a dozen times of Turquoise's heart's blood, and the great carcass rolled lifeless upon the ground, it was a primeval woman who sprang forward with outstretched arms toward the primeval man who had fought for her and won her. And Tarzan? He did what no red-blooded man needs lessons in doing. He took his woman in his arms and smothered her upturned, panting lips with kisses. Okay. Spicy. For a moment, Jane Porter lay there with half-closed eyes. For a moment, the first in her young life, she knew the meaning of love. But as suddenly as the veil had been withdrawn, it dropped again, and an outraged conscience suffused her face with scarlet mantle, and a mortified woman thrust Tarzan of the Apes from her and buried her face in her hands. Tarzan had been surprised when he had found the girl he had learned to love after a vague and abstract manner, a willing prisoner in his arms. Now he was surprised that she repulsed him. He came close to her once more and took hold of her arm. She turned upon him like a tigress, striking his great breast with her tiny hands. Tarzan could not understand it. A moment ago, it had been his intention to hasten Jane Porter back to her people. Jane Porter back to her people. But that little moment was lost now in the dim and distant past of things which were, but can never be, again, and with it the good intention had gone to join the impossible. Since then, Tarzan of the Apes had felt a warm, lithe form close pressed to his, hot, sweet breath against his cheek and mouth, and had fanned a new flame to life within his breast, and perfect lips had clung to his in burning kisses that had seared a deep brand into his soul, a brand which marked a new Tarzan. Again he laid his hand upon her arm. Again she repulsed him, and then Tarzan of the Apes did just what his first ancestor would have done. He took his woman in his arms and carried her into the jungle. Porter, I hardly knew her. Fair. Early the following morning, the four within the little cabin by the beach were awakened by the booming of a cannon. Clayton was the first to rush out, and there, beyond the harbor's mouth, he saw two vessels lying at anchor. One was the Arrow, and the other a small French cruiser. The sides of the latter were crowded with men gazing shoreward, and it was evident to Clayton, as to the others, who had now joined him, that the gun which they had heard had been fired to attract their attention if they still remained at the cabin. Both vessels lay at a considerable distance from shore, and it was doubtful if their glasses would locate the waving hats of the little party far in between the harbor's points. Esmeralda had removed her red apron and was waving it frantically above her head, but Clayton, still fearing that even this might not be seen, hurried off toward the northern point where lay his signal pyre, ready for the match. It seemed an age to him, as to those who waited breathlessly behind, ere he reached the great pile of dry branches and underbrush. As he broke from the dense wood and came in sight of the vessel again, he was filled with consternation to see that the Arrow was making sail and that the cruiser was already under way. Quickly, lighting the pyre in a dozen places, he hurried to the extreme point of the promontory, where he stripped off his shirt and, tying it to a fallen branch, stood waving it back and forth above him. But still the vessels continued to stand out, and he had given up all hope, when the great column of smoke, arising from the forest in one dense vertical shaft, attracted the attention of a lookout aboard the cruiser, and instantly a dozen glasses were leveled on the beach. Presently Clayton saw the two ships come about again, and while the Arrow lay drifting quietly on the ocean, the cruiser steamed slowly back toward shore. At some distance away she stopped, and a boat was lowered and dispatched toward the beach. As it was drawn up, a young officer stepped out. "Monsieur Clayton, I presume?" he asked. "Thank God, you have come," was Clayton's reply, "and it may be that it is not too late even now." "What do you mean, monsieur?" asked the officer. Clayton told of the abduction of Jane Porter, and the need of armed men to aid in the search for her. "Mon Dieu!" exclaimed the officer sadly. "Yesterday, and it would have been too late. Today, and it may be better than the poor lady were never found. It is horrible, monsieur. It is too horrible." Other boats had now put off from the cruiser, and Clayton, having pointed out the harbor's entrance to the officer, entered the boat with him, and its nose was turned toward the little landlocked bay, into which the other craft followed. Soon the entire party had landed where stood Professor Porter, Mr. Philander, and the weeping Esmeralda. Among the officers in the last boats to put off from the cruiser was the commander of the vessel, and when he had heard the story of Jane Porter's abduction, he generously called for volunteers to accompany Professor Porter and Clayton in their search. Not an officer or a man was there of those brave and sympathetic Frenchmen who did not quickly beg leave to be one of the expedition. The commander selected 20 men and 2 officers, Lieutenant d'Arnaud and Lieutenant Charpentier. A boat was dispatched to the cruiser for provisions, ammunition, and carbines. The men were already armed with revolvers. Then, to Clayton's inquiries as to how they had happened to anchor offshore and fire a signal gun, the commander, Captain Dufresne, explained that a month before they had sighted the Arrow bearing southwest under considerable canvas, and that when they had signaled her to come about, she had but crowded on more sail. They had kept her hull up until sunset, firing several shots after her, but the next morning she was nowhere to be seen. They had then continued to cruise up and down the coast for several weeks, and had forgotten the incident of the recent chase, when early one morning, a few days before, the lookout had descried a vessel laboring in the trough of a heavy sea, and evidently entirely from under control. As they steamed nearer to the derelict, they were surprised to note that it was the same vessel that had run from them a few weeks earlier. Her forestay sail and mizzen spanker were set as though an effort had been made to hold her head up into the wind, but the sheets had parted, and the sails were tearing to ribbons in the half-gale of wind. In the high sea that was running it was a difficult and dangerous task to attempt to put a prize crew aboard her, and as no signs of life had been seen above deck, it was decided to stand by until the wind and sea abated. But just then a figure was seen clinging to the rail and feebly waving a mute signal of despair toward them. Immediately a boat's crew was ordered out, and an attempt was successfully made to board the Arrow. The sight that met the Frenchmen's eyes as they clambered over the ship's side was appalling. A dozen dead and dying men rolled hither and thither upon the pitching deck. The living intermingled with the dead. 2 of the corpses appeared to have been partially devoured as though by wolves. Yikes. The prize crew soon had the vessel under proper sail once more, and the living members of the ill-starred company carried below to their hammocks. The dead were wrapped in tarpaulins and lashed on deck to be identified by their comrades before consigned to the deep. None of the living was conscious when the Frenchmen reached the Arrow's deck. Even the poor devil who had waved the single despairing signal of distress had lapsed into unconsciousness before he had learned whether it had availed or not. It did not take the French officer long to learn what had caused the terrible condition aboard, for when water and brandy were sought to restore the men, it was found that not only was there not any of either, but not a vestige of food of any description. He immediately signaled to the cruiser to send water, medicine, and provisions, and another boat made the perilous trip to the Arrow. When restoratives had been applied, several of the men regained consciousness, and then the whole story was told. That part of it we know up to the sailing of the Arrow after the murder of Snipes and the burial of his body above the treasure chest. It seems that the pursuit by the cruiser had so terrorized the mutineers that they had continued out across the Atlantic for several days after losing her, but on discovering the meager supply of water and provisions aboard, they had turned back toward the east. When no one on board who understood navigation, discussion soon arose as to their whereabouts. And as 3 days' sailing to the east did not raise land, they bore off to the north, fearing that the high north winds that had prevailed had driven them south of the southern extremity of Africa. They kept on a north-northeasterly course for 2 days, when they were overtaken by a calm which lasted for nearly a week. Their water was gone, and in another day they would be without food. Conditions changed rapidly from bad to worse. One man went mad and leaped overboard. Soon another opened his veins and drank his own blood. Whoa. Dark. When he died, they threw him overboard also, though there were those among them who wanted to keep the corpse on board. Hunger was changing them from human beasts to wild beasts. 2 days before they had been picked up by the cruiser, they had become too weak to handle the vessel, and that same day 3 men died. On the following morning it was seen that one of the corpses had been partially devoured. Dark. All that day the men lay glaring at each other like beasts of prey, and the following morning 2 of the corpses lay almost entirely stripped of flesh. The men were but little stronger for their ghoulish repast, for the want of water was by far the greatest agony with which they had to contend. And then the cruiser had come. When those who could had recovered, the entire story had been told to the French commander, but the men were too ignorant to be able to tell him at just what point on the coast the professor and his party had been marooned, so the cruiser had steamed slowly along within sight of land, firing occasional signal guns and scanning every inch of the beach with glasses. They had anchored by night so as not to neglect a particle of the shoreline, and it had happened that the preceding night had brought them off the very beach where lay the little camp they sought. The signal guns of the afternoon before had not been heard by those on shore. It was presumed because they had doubtless been in the thick of the jungle searching for Jane Porter, where the noise of their own crashing through the underbrush would have drowned the report of a far distant gun. By the time the 2 parties had narrated their several adventures, the cruiser's boat had returned with supplies and arms for the expedition. Within a few minutes, the little body of sailors and the 2 French officers, together with Professor Porter and Clayton, set off upon their hopeless and ill-fated quest into the untracked jungle. Dun dun dun. Dee-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee. That was dark. So, even if they hadn't brutally murdered Snipes and buried his body over the chest that they dug a place to hide, even if he hadn't died, because King was dead, there was no one with the experience to navigate that giant vessel, the Arrow. And a lot of people died unnecessarily because of their own hubris. The ghoulish repast is quite a way to describe what had happened. That whole chapter was dark. Hi Revy, welcome in. And also, every time I hear Snipes, I think of Letterkenny. Fair. Yeah, that was a pretty dark chapter. Can we go back to Professor Porter and Mr. Philander running from a lion in the woods? I think that was much better. That was a much nicer chapter. Okay, we are on... I don't have a chance in heck of reading another whole chapter before I have to do an ad break. It is... Well, if I call it here... That would be 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. That's 5 chapters. If I call it here, we could probably find someone to raid, and that will have been just shy of 3 hours worth of reading today. I think that'll be a good plan. I'm gonna go take the dogs out for a nice hike. I've been visiting a couple of different lakes lately, and they've been really enjoying getting out, and I feel like with the weather what it is, it would be nice to be outside touching grass, because I'm probably not going to be seeing much more sunshine in the near future as fall and winter approaches, and winter is coming, so to speak. Aw, thank you, Alan and Bill the Duck. Yeah, I miss my boys clutching each other in the trees. It's true. The best bromance is Mr. Philander and Professor Archimedes, I believe. Q Porter. What an amazing name. All right, everyone. I will begin the search to find somebody to raid. Also, if you guys haven't seen Revy, that's another, like, I think you need a shout out and Revy need a shout out as well. If you guys haven't seen their content, you really should check them both out. Valis is newer to streaming. I'm not sure if we have enough clips yet. Yeah, that'll work. Give it a minute. I'll probably find some ancient pre-live 2D model. Or it won't do anything at all, because that is Guru. Oh, there it is. It just took a minute.
The hands, bro.
I don't know why that is so bad. The hands. Yeah, the hands. Yeah, that was pretty loud. Guru doesn't do an audio level, so that's on Guru. Anyway, you guys, Revy is another amazing streamer. I found them through Bonecaller's stream, and honestly, one of the nicest guys that I've gotten to like chatter and talk to in Bone's stream. And then also, they play a lot of really cool retro games. So if you haven't checked out their content, I highly recommend it. Yeah. Rev's a cool guy. I think he's pretty rad. But alright, let's find somebody. Maybe Neff or Tiger Faye or someone is streaming and we can go visit them. Sino is Sino is doing some art with pets. My friend Sassy Cheese is playing some Skyrim. Giz is doing some art. Horatius is on. Man, okay, I think fairly recently rated them. Asim is doing a horror game. Nikto is playing StarCraft. Alex is playing Roblox and doing a fashion show, what it looks like. Tavern Manager. My goodness. Voices of the Void. Valorant. Art. Atlas. Anybody? Is anybody in the category reading? Let's see. What do we got? Cassiria is reading Vampire Hunter D. Holy Feast and nope. Friday Do the Things, reading fun. Write it down. Save your work. Friday to Do the Things sprints. I'm not sure what that is. That'll be an examination for another time. Who shall we find? No, not by category. Perhaps by reading. Tag me, tag, tag. Somebody's writing a novel. Somebody is chatting. Dead by Daylight. My goodness. Okay. I will just I will go ahead and just look for somebody that I say like and get to visit. I think an art stream would be chill, or Trials of Mana would be nice. I think either, yeah, let's go. We're gonna go visit Sino. I haven't rated them in a minute. So, and they're never usually streaming when I'm still streaming, so this will work out perfectly. Better late than never. Meeting your pets. Oh, I think they're doing an art stream to do draw their community's pets. They do some really cute ones. Okay. All right, everyone. Grab your hats. Hang on tight. A real quick raid message. Let's put that together before we raid him. Real quick, what are we doing? I don't know. leaving library and the brutality of Tarzan. Of the Apes. And one of these. Copy pasta. Boop. Copy pasta. Copy pasta. There we go. And then maybe a cute little raid at the end. Ba ba ba. There we go. Okay. So I'll leave that in there if you guys can grab it. It is a follower specific raid message, so anybody can use that is following me. Looks like they are still doing their intro sound, so we'll just sit tight. Oh, I think they're officially live. It looks like nope, somebody's just playing their fishing game. Alright guys, we're just gonna sit here and look cool and vibe for a couple of minutes while we wait for Sino. But I hope everyone is having a great day and that you enjoy the stream. And we got pretty far in the story. We're past the midway point, so I imagine if I do the math on this correctly. Let's see, we did about 70-ish pages today. So if we're by that metric, let's see. Dun, 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 dun. I can hear my neighbor drilling something. That is funny. Well, I'm glad that you enjoyed the reading stream, Dallas. I hope the rest of your workday is easy peasy lemon squeezy. So, alright, we're gonna raid Sino anyway, because I don't want you guys to have to deal with another ad. I will. The mountainous range with the lakes that I'm going to go to is going to be absolutely spectacular. And let's see. Boy. I want to raid you, nerd. Man. So Sino is one of the creators that I have been following. Oh gosh, I don't even know how many months now. I feel like it's definitely been more than 6 months. I don't know if it's quite 9 months. 8 months. I have been a subscriber in their channel for 8 months. They are one of the coolest, cute little guy streamers that I have ever seen. And I absolutely love their content. Their art, their little guy art streams. I was actually, I did a guest appearance on their stream, and we did Monster Prom 4, the campfire one. And it was Sabrina Scissor Runner, and myself, and then Sino all doing the voices for all the various characters. It was a good time. 10 out of 10 would recommend. Sino is one of the coolest guys. If you're looking for a really chill collaborator, I would definitely check out their content. Okay, so we're gonna let her rip because I don't want you guys to have to deal with a raid or an ad. So hang on to your hats, everyone. We're gonna go raid Sino the Crocodile. And thank you again, all of you, for another amazing stream. And I will see you guys on, if not on Sunday, I will see you on Monday. Have a good one.